Now there's a few more that aren't really related to files and directories, and they aren't really related to comparison either. They're kind of special ones. Let's have a look at those. These are used in combination with the options that I've just shown you. Test exclamation mark expression. Now you read the exclamation mark as the word not, so you can think of this as returning not the expression. So if the expression is false, then test will give you a value of true, and vice versa. And the expression is one of the things that we saw earlier, like is the file writable? Then you could say, well, I'll show you an example. Now we've just tested to see whether etc password is writable, and we found that it's not. So now let's test to see whether it is not writable, and we find that that is true. It is true, so etc password is not writable. We can also test to see whether two expressions are both true using the -a option. -a is short for AND. You can read this as saying test to see if expression 1 is true and expression 2 is true. Now I'll give you a little demonstration of that as well. Here's a little script that ties everything together. We're using test in conjunction with an if statement, and we're actually using an elif clause as well and an else clause. So the first thing we do is we ask the user to enter a file name, read it in, and the very first thing we do is we test whether they actually did type it in. And if they didn't, then we give them an error message. Now if they did, then the next thing we test is whether the file that they specified exists, using test -f to see if it is a regular file and not a directory. And then we also test using the -a option for AND to see if it is writable by us, and if so, we specify the appropriate message. So let's see this in action. The first thing we'll do is we'll run the program, and it says please enter a file name, and we won't, and it says you did not enter a file name. That is correct, I just pressed enter. Okay, we'll do it again, and this time please enter a file name, and I'll just enter some garbage. The file is not a writable file. That sounds pretty reasonable. And how about if I run it again, and this time I say a file name of dot. Now dot is a directory. It's writable, but it's not an actual regular file. So we'll say it's not a writable file. It's actually a writable directory. Let's now try a file that is not a directory. It's a regular file, but it's read-only, and that is not a writable file. That's correct. And finally, we will try a real writable file, which, well, we'll use this one. Test file is the name of this actual program, and everything is fine because that is an actual writable file. Excellent. So that's the -a option in action. Similarly, there is a -o option. The -o is short for OR, and you can read that as saying test will return true if expression 1 is true or expression 2 is true. In other words, if either one is true. Finally, we come to a very interesting fact about the test program. Test has an alias, and the alias is the open square bracket. Now that's a very odd name for a program, but that is an actual valid program name. So what I'm saying is, anytime you could have typed in the word test, you can now actually type in the open square bracket symbol instead. Now why would they do such a thing? Well, let's have a look. It means that our earlier example could have been written like this. Now, just test to see whether one variable is greater than the maximum. So we use the open square bracket instead of the word test. Now notice that there is a close square bracket there on the end of the line. And that's one of the curious features of the test program. If you use the alias of the open square bracket, then test will actually give you a syntax error if you forget to put in the closed square bracket. But if you just use the regular word test, then you don't need the closed square bracket. Let's just check that that actually works. I'm going to rewrite that little script that I just showed you. Let's have a look at that. Here's that script, and now I'll just go to this word test and put a bracket in like that, and I'll do the same thing here. Now, because I'm using the square bracket, I actually have to use the closed square bracket, and I'll do the same here as well. Okay, well actually, no. What I'll do is I'll omit the closing square bracket there, and I'll run this program and see if it works. So it says please enter a file name, and so I will enter one. Now notice there missing close square bracket. So I'll run it again, and this time I'll put the square bracket in like that and execute that. Test 1, 2, 3. The file is not a writable file, that's fine, but notice that I did not get an error message, which means of course that the closing square bracket fixed the problem. Now why do you suppose that they've invented this particular curious alias for the test program? Well, if you've ever been a programmer before, then you might actually feel more comfortable with surrounding your test conditions with brackets. To your eyes, that might actually look like a more valid use of the if statement, which is, of course, exactly why it was done. So it would look more like an if statement from, say, the programming language C. Now, C uses round brackets instead of square brackets. The round brackets were already used for something in the shell, so they invented the use of the square bracket. So it's still the test program there, it's still running as the program called test, but it's pretending to be integrated into the shell and just a valid part of an if statement. So that's a little bit of cleverness there on behalf of the people that designed the test program. Now, because using the square brackets is actually much more intuitive when you get used to it than using the word test, or at least I find it to be, and most programmers that I know find it to be, this is actually the preferred use of the word test. Very few people actually write out the word test, T-E-S-T. Most people just use the square brackets notation because it looks better. It looks aesthetically more pleasing to the programmer's eye. So that's it. That's test. A very, very useful program. Probably 90% of the time that we use the if statement, we're also using the test program as well. Okay, let's move on.